I am getting into an issue that concerns me personally today, but I think it's a very important political issue on the world stage, and that is the question of Israel, of a potential conflict in the state of Israel between the secularists and the religious, the left and the right, and arguments over, for starters, the election of the Netanyahu government and the conflict over judicial reform. To discuss the matter, we're joined from Israel by Avi Lipkin. Avi is an author of many books. Avi, you and I have talked over the years. BiblicalAlliance.com is your website. Avi, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So, Avi, the news coming out of Israel is that when the Netanyahu government took power and they were duly elected and the legitimate government of Israel, and there's been no accusations of any kind of a fraud going on in that election, which is not the case here in the United States, as you know. The government immediately was opposed by street rallies from secularists who were concerned over a program of judicial reform by which the Netanyahu government wanted to rein in some of the powers of the judicial branch, which they claimed had overstepped itself. So, if you don't mind, Avi, could you give us a quick synopsis of this debate and this argument?
Okay, well, firstly, Israel is a very, very newly recreated country. As you probably know, in 1867, Mark Twain visited the Holy Land, the Promised Land, and it was so forlorn and so empty that Mark Twain said, if this is the Promised Land, I sure don't want it promised to me. That was his sense of humor. I think that President Abraham Lincoln's last word after he was shot was, I wish I could go to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, Israel, is a very important place for everyone. But from the early stages, there was a domination of the political system by, I don't want to say Soviet socialists, but Marxist, Leninist, socialists who were hoping to create a revolution like the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia.
Okay, let's just stop right there, because besides Mark Twain, former President Ulysses Grant visited Israel in the 1870s and basically said the same thing, that it was poor and backward, and there was a lot of swamps and deserts, and there was just not much going on. I think at that time you had Jewish communities, obviously continuous, especially in Jerusalem and in Sfat and in other cities. And you always had Jews trying to make Aliyah to Israel. But you also note that the core of the modern Zionist movement were really far left socialist, Russian Jews and Polish Jews who wanted to replicate a communist utopia in Israel, but that didn't happen. After David Ben-Gurion stood up and had the nerve and the courage to declare independence on May of 1948, Israel shifted and leaned toward the United States, and the Soviet Union was rebuffed, and that has been the condition ever since.
Okay. Firstly, I do have to commend Ben-Gurion's decision to remain neutral in the Cold War. Stalin was indeed one of the first leaders to recognize the Jewish state, because he was sure that Israel was going to join the Soviet bloc.
Right.
But Israel was so impoverished. We only had 600,000 people in the country, and all of a sudden there were millions of refugees pouring into the country. And the United States, especially the Jews of the United States, 6 million of them were considered extremely critical in the funding of the camps. To absorb all these immigrants Whereas if we went with the Russians, there wouldn't be very much to eat. And also, the idea was this, that there was a great respect by the socialist leadership of Israel for Russia. But the idea was, moving forward, the United States and the West provided a pool of potential immigration and a pool of potential investments that could bring Israel into the modern world. And so Ben Gurion went over to, neutrality, but the political system of Israel remained socialist.
Yes, socialist, not communist.
No, not
And
communist.
I think that's also safe to say that there was always a capitalist element in Israel, and that from day one, Israel moved in the general direction of the free market and away from the socialistic, centralized type of control. That development accelerated pretty much in the 1970s and 80s with the election first of Begin and then of Netanyahu. And that today Israel is very much a free market republic or state. They call it startup nation. There's all this incredible amount of entrepreneurialism and energy coming out of Israel. And in that sense, Israel actually is, in the literal sense, not to mention spiritually, a light unto the nation, certainly in the Middle East, as an example of a country that can have democratic principles and prosperity through capitalist principles.
Correct. But what I wanted to emphasize is that from the early 1920s, and you have to remember my specialty, what I learned in college was Sovietology, communism, socialism, because I was in the States in the late 60s. This is at the height of the Cold War. And my approach was to defeat the enemy in Soviet Russia. You had to learn about it. You had to learn the ideology.
Yes.
And basically, the ideology of the Israeli leadership was socialist. And people like me who were nationalists were pushed to the side. We weren't murdered like in Soviet Russia, but we were denied jobs. And I don't know how much you know about me. I don't know what Jerry told you, but I've been preaching in Christian churches for the last 33 years because when I was fired from the Prime Minister's office, they said to me, "We know your political views. You're fired. We're going to put lies in your file. You will never, ever again get a job in Israel." And they were right. And who was it who embraced me and took care of me? It was the Christian evangelicals in the United States, Canada, and Europe. But these people, you may have democratic elections, and Netanyahu may be fairly elected, but the people who control the civil service, the army, the police, these are all, and the judicial system, these are the same socialist holdovers of the last 100 years.
So that the establishment pretty much remains at least left of center, if not outright socialist, going back to the days of the original coalition of Ben Gurion, which was pretty left of center, and that the establishment, there was a sort of an internal struggle between them and the Begin branch, the Likud, which became the Likud, and that conflict almost became a civil war. I mean, the sinking of the Athalena. And there were other instances, and apparently one of the young soldiers who was standing on the beach in Tel Aviv firing missiles at the Athalena was none other than Yitzhak Rabin. So, yeah, so you have, the almost on the verge, but Israel did not cross that Rubicon. They did hold together. Begin was part of the coalition under Ben Gurion. He was there with Ben Gurion during the 7-Day War. I mean, there was a unity between the two sides, even though the labor unions, the Histadrut, and the establishment, they all maintained the high ground, and they were all on the left. Now, the other factor that I think is coming to play in the present conflict is the religious factor. There was what was called the status quo between Rav Kook and Ben Gurion. which sort of was a compromise that allowed Israel to proceed as a secular Jewish state, but at the same time gave certain areas of certain categories of influence to the rabbinate and to the Orthodox, and that included such matters as questions of Jewish life, who is a Jew, marriage, matters of conversion, that these things, this whole portfolio was left in the hands of the Orthodox. Now, the accusations being made by the secularists is that the Orthodox have become more extreme, maybe more reactionary in recent decades in terms of defining who is a Jew. There have been accusations that they're all on welfare, they're not working, that they're on state support, and that they're corrupt in that they receive subsidies from the government, that a lot of their young men and women do not have public service. They don't go into the army, so that they're being defended by the secular side of the society, which has to go out and fight the wars, and that there's a lot of growing resentment over that. That combined with the birth rate of the Orthodox, which is enormous, you have huge families, it's creating this kind of a conflict. Now, look, I'm giving what I understand to be that side of the story. On the other side, of course, you have the secularists who are anti-Jewish in many cases, anti-American. They're just like the American left. They're far, they're extremists. And I suppose if you go to the absolute extremist, and Israel is one of these fascinating places where you have such incredibly opposite opinions existing in the same tiny space. But if you go to the extremes on both sides, you have people who do not recognize Israel and who are anti-Israel. On the right, you have the elements of the Neturei Karta who don't recognize the Jewish state, and I see rabbis standing out and visiting the mullahs in Tehran. On the left side, you have people like this general's son. I forget his name. I had him on my show. He was very hostile. Who is talking about Israel becoming a secular, democratic nation which is not Jewish and which everybody's equal and everybody sits around a campfire and wiggles their toes. So I guess that I want to look more at the center here. And I'm wondering, is there areas where agreement could be arrived at?
Okay, well, obviously, we are all optimistic people, and we're all looking for a non-violent conclusion to the present crisis. I have to tell you, I've been in Israel. I'm from New York. I talk like a New Yorker.
Yeah, you do.
I'm here.
I noticed this.
I've been here since 1968.
Okay.
So I've been here 55 years. I served 30 years in the Israeli Army Reserve, 16 in artillery and 14 as an Army spokesman. And I've seen the miracle that this country has gone through. The development of the economy, the development of the roads, the educational system, and agriculture, and high-tech. Israel is indeed a stamp collection of miracles. Every stamp in the album is a miracle.
Indeed.
And everybody contributes in their own way. But let me give you, I'm going to go off on a slightly different tangent and come back with information.
Okay.
I'm the founder and leader of a Judeo-Christian political party in Israel called the Bible. We have only 40 political parties in Israel. 40. And the Bible Party is the only party that has candidates who are Christian or Messianic. It's a Jewish party. We have Jewish candidates, but we also have Christian candidates and Messianic candidates. No other party, 39 other parties, they have no Christian or Messianic candidates. Virtually, we have a few Americans who are candidates. You do not see really a representation of American-born people in the Israeli party. Now, having been here 55 years, I have seen the explosive growth of the ultra-Orthodox in the land of Israel.
Okay.
And when Ben Gurion gave them that first exemption process of 400 or 500 holders could be exempted so they could study Torah, their population was very small. The country grew 10 times. So if you go 500 10 times, you think, okay, you have 5,000 exemptions for yeshiva students. But you have today 150,000 yeshiva students who don't work, don't go to the army, don't pay taxes. But the criminal part of this is that the rabbis who are getting paid per head. Every yeshiva student is the budget for the rabbis. The rabbis are making big money. And they say to these young couples, get married early, have 10 children, and then when the children get married in 20 years, they should have 10 children. So this thing is exploding like an atomic bomb. And so in this case, the left-wing people who are protesting the judicial reforms, they're right that this can become a theocracy.
Right.
And I have to tell you, these ultra-Orthodox, let me tell you, they hate the Messianics, they hate the Christians. But listen, they hate the Reformed Jews from America, don't want them to come to Israel. They hate the conservative Jews, they hate the unaffiliated Jews. They even hate Jews with a knitted kippah like the one I have, because they wear black kippah, like uniform.
Right.
I'm really not Orthodox, I'm really conservative. And so they don't want anyone coming to Israel to live here unless they are ultra-Orthodox. But then who's going to pay?
Well, that's the problem. I mean, if they run the show, the whole country's going to implode. I mean, who's going to pay the taxes that keeps them on their welfare, and who's going to defend the borders when all their guys are Torah scholars? Now, I had Rachel Ehrenfeld on this program, and she tends to be sympathetic to their position. And she says to me that I'm not correct in that she said the majority of them now are serving in the army. They are at least doing some kind of national service. They are getting professions. And that at the same time, there is a number of them who actually are genuine Talmudic scholars. And that, yeah, we might give an exemption for someone who really can raise to that level. My sense is that because of the money involved and the corruption, when ever you start handing out grants, you're going to have people who are grifters, who really aren't scholarly, and that the government is giving an incentive to this. I mean, in a way, it's comparable in the United States to the way the COVID pandemic was handled. I mean, these hospitals started to get money every time they got a COVID case, even though somebody was there for other reasons. And there was an incentive to hype up and almost weaponize that pandemic for reasons that I don't completely understand. But the point I'm making here is that when the government gets involved and they start giving incentives, it can warp the social condition. So what, Avi, do you suggest be done to, on the one hand, allow the ultra-Orthodox to continue their lifestyle, but on the other hand, to put their power in a little bit more of an appropriate context? Because after all, are they not very much a part of the present government coalition?
Okay, well, you didn't cut me off, but I wanted to continue to develop.
Please, go right ahead.
I'm going to go to another country now. You've heard of Turkey.
Right.
And you've heard of Ataturk.
Mm-hmm.
And Ataturk wanted to modernize Turkey. He wanted to erase the caliphate. And what happened was he was saying proper Turkish family should have one child and one dog. And so the Ataturk type Turks in the cities, Istanbul and Ankara and Izmir, they'd have one child and one dog. This is how the Europeans were. And this is a time when Turkey really developed and became like a Western nation. But what happened was, over the decades, the interior of Turkey, the agrarian person, they still have 10 kids per family. And so when the industrialization took place, a lot of the children of these very religious Muslim families would migrate into the city, and then little by little, Istanbul and all these other cities had a Muslim, fanatic Muslim majority, and the attitude position is gone. And all the first person to be thrown out was judges, and bring in Muslim judges, and then get rid of the secular generals. The secular generals will bring about a revolution. And so Turkey today is more in the direction of the traditional extreme Islam. And so what has happened in Israel, now we've off into something really, I say things a little extreme. The liberal Jews of Tel Aviv, we say we have the state of Israel and we have the state of Tel Aviv. The state of Tel Aviv liberal Jews have one child in the. And what's been happening, I've been here 55 years, what has been happening over the 55 years is that the left-wing liberals are about 15% of the voters. 15%.
Right.
And the Likud is about 25%, and the religious are about 20%. I mean, when you put it together, the Likud comes out with 64 out of 100 members of the Knesset. And this is after, I would say, maybe 10 members of Knesset who were Likud broke away from the Likud because of personal differences with Netanyahu. So my first conclusion is, I love Netanyahu. I think he's the greatest prime minister we ever had. But he's got to go. Because in America, you have things called term limits. I believe in term limits. Netanyahu is still prime minister, the greatest prime minister, but he's been prime minister 13 years. He is suppressing the younger lieutenants in the party. And what happens is they quit the party, they form another party, and they join the opposition. But even joining the opposition, Netanyahu still has 64 out of 100 members of Knesset. So if you're asking me what has to happen, I would say if you let nature take its course, the right-wing religion will go up to 66, 67, 70 members of Knesset, and the power of the left-wing people is getting weaker and weaker, and it's a question of patience.
Well, I mean, but the point, then what you're saying is that Israel is heading in the direction of becoming a very highly theocratic state in the same way that what's happened with Turkey?
At this time, yes, but I think eventually what will happen is you have, of course, the leader of the Blue and White Party, Lapid, and you have the Blue and White is gone. He's centrist, and people are talking today about Gantz, prime minister candidate, joining with Netanyahu, and then having the Orthodox basically pushed out. I mean, there are a number of possibilities being cooked up. Officially, our next election will be October 2026, but I would not be surprised if at some stage you see a reshuffle, and then Netanyahu may be joining up with Gantz. They're fighting each other. They're on good terms.
Right. I mean, look, I would think that somehow the ultra orthodox, the Haredim, the people who are not serving, they have to have that funding cut off. I mean, let them have children if they want, but let them support them and let them get professions, and let nature take its course, as you would say. And I think the result would be a little bit smaller a family, frankly. Not that I'm not a eugenicist here. I mean, people have a right to have as big a family as they want. But if they're not getting a financial state incentive, then they're probably not going to do that, and they're going to find means by which to support themselves in a free market system. So, I mean, the problem, it's like anything else. It's like in this country, the problem of welfare, which was supposed to address poverty in the United States in the 60s, the Great War on Poverty, Lyndon Johnson, it created social problems. It gave incentives for women to get rid of their husbands and then to have more children. It created children who didn't have fathers and didn't have direction. And that combined with the bad economic policies resulted in an underclass and a criminal problem. So, when the government interferes by with these massive welfare programs, it creates social dislocation and social problem. And in the case of Israel, they're funding a very radicalized, fundamental Jewish entity.
I have to add another thing also, that I don't want to mention names. It wouldn't make a difference to you anyway, but I have family members who are Haredi, that they're also Orthodox.
Right.
And they live in poverty. And it breaks my heart because I see the poverty that the children live in. And actually, once I was picking my wife up. My wife worked at the Israeli radio monitoring service for 30 years. So I would pick her up at midnight, and we would get to where you've been in Israel, where the light rail system is, just outside the Moscowitz. And there's a traffic light there, right bordering on what used to be the borderline there. And we saw a Haredi boy, must be 16, 17, with a black hat and everything. And he was panhandling. And I said to him, "Why are you begging?" He said, "I'm hungry." I said, "But don't you have food in the yeshiva?" He said, "I'm hungry." And the light turned green. Everybody started hungry. And so I bought. So I said to my wife, "We have to go back and give him money so he can go and eat something." And we came back, and he was gone. He was gone by then. But the lesson that I learned is that it cannot be the Jewish kids are hungry because the rabbis are making money from the funding of the government, for every yeshiva student to get money. Breaks my heart. And it is a danger to the future of the country. So what I think will happen someday, and I'm praying for wisdom with Netanyahu, to be patient and write out the next 4 years, even if we have to sacrifice the judicial reform for now. There has to be judicial reform. But let the numbers improve for the next election, and then these ultra-socialists have to be rooted out of the civil service.
So just to before we go on to the socialists, I want to recap. I want to just cap the issue of the Haredim and the ultra-Orthodox. They have developed, besides the fact that it seems like there's a major amount of corruption there, with the rabbis basically getting financial incentives. They also have the hubris, frankly, of claiming that they have some sort of a monopoly control over what it is to be a Jew.
Correct.
This is like, who are they to decide, whether or not somebody is Jewish enough if they come into the country? I understand that there needs to be some standards. I get the fact that, for example, a lot of the Russian immigrants were actually not Jewish, and that they wanted to come into Israel because there were reasons of economy. But at the same time, their standards are unrealistically high, and they're not really based on real present day issues. They're based on some sort of an anarchic diaspora view that, particularly an Ashkenazi view, it was not so much a Sephardic thing, where they really went through an ultra period of isolation that was actually well above and beyond the Talmudic idea, and that they want to now impose that on Israel. And I'll give you one quick example here. Ivanka Trump, right? Jared Kushner's wife, President Trump's daughter. She converted to Orthodox Judaism when she married Jared. They're bringing up their children. She lives a pretty Orthodox life. They observe Shabbos. They're kosher. She loves Judaism. She loves Shabbos. But there's a rabbi amongst these groups who have said, well, she's not really Jewish enough. He doesn't recognize her Jewishness. And she's angry about it. And who gives him that power? Where does that come from? That's so, it's so arbitrary and so outrageous. What do they think they are? Emperors? What is it? Is this like King Solomon or something?
Yeah, but they really would take the sword and cut the baby in half.
Yeah.
Let me, with your permission, give you a little bit of background. Okay?
Yeah.
I was born and raised in Great Neck, New York.
Okay.
And my parents were not religious at all, but they wanted me to get a Hebrew education. So I went to Temple Israel of Great Neck, which is the biggest, probably the only conservative synagogue in Great Neck. You've got lots of Orthodox, and you have two or three Reform. But Temple Israel is the conservative
Right.
synagogue.
The Stadtschule of the area.
And I was always very used to men and women sitting together. And you had pews, and families sat together.
Right.
I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I want my wife, and if I had a daughter, I would want my daughter to sit with me during prayers. And so the local Orthodox say, Avi, you've been contaminated by the Christians, because the Christians sit together in their worship service. And I say, no, you've been contaminated by the Muslims, because you segregate the sex. So you see, it says in the Talmud, it also says in Islamic tradition, the voice of woman is losing. And so if you see a woman, or you hear a woman, this contaminates the holiness of, that's how they believe.
Well, they're doing an extreme interpretation of that. I mean,
but that's what's controlling the country. Now, so you go to the old city, you go to the Wailing. And I understand that you should have a place for men alone, even though during the time of the church, there was no separate seating. Everyone mixed. But now they have a men's area and a women's area, and I'm a conservative too. I would like to see a mixed.
Well, don't they have that also? They have like men's, women's, and mixed, right?
Right, but there is no mixed.
No, there's no mixed.
They say it's a contamination. In other words, Reform and conservative Judaism are taboo at the Western Wall.
Well, they're wrong. I mean, look, if they want to observe that, let them have their corner of the Western Wall where they can be as, I know I'm using a liberal word here, but they can be as misogynistic as they want and deny women, which, by the way, the Torah says that God created men and women in his image. And it does say women, not just men. But if they want to have this really kind of like an interpretation of Judaism that I think probably was typical maybe 400 or 500 years ago amongst both Jews and Christians, but it was before, people became aware of, it was before the Enlightenment, let's put it that way. Then let them have it. I mean, as long as it's voluntary, but what gives them the right to impose that on an entire country? That's the problem.
Israeli politics.
Yeah, I mean, if they want to separate, I don't have a problem actually in the shul if they want to have a mechitza and separate men and women in prayer. Personally, I like to pray with my own wife and daughter, and I like to sit in the pew. But if they want to do the separation, I've been there. That's fine. I don't have a problem with it as long as it's voluntary and as long as it's not imposed, but they want to impose that, and they want to, as if this is somehow such a central tenet of Judaism, which it's not. It's more of a custom that developed, more 400 or 500 years ago.
I have to tell you, I studied to be a conservative rabbi in 1990 to 1994. And we had a very, very wonderful, I think he's still alive, but he's getting older. And he was an expert on theology in the 7th century synagogue, especially in Turkey. And for the Christians, they have the big 7 cities in Turkey. But anyway, so they found the synagogue, and the name of the leaders of the synagogue were etched into the, they were chiseled, the name of the, so you had the name of the rabbi, and next to him, there was a woman, and it was called Matrona. I don't remember the name. Matrona is the motherly leader of the congregation.
Right.
So the rabbi sat next to a woman, and every seat had a name etched into it. And it was men, women. So you're right. this is something of the last few centuries, and I think what we need really is for the pendulum to swing back to normal thinking.
Yeah, and also it's so crazy that, frankly, I'm sorry to use that word, but there was a woman who was not, she was Orthodox and she wasn't allowed to address an audience, and she had very important things to offer them, and she was completely sneers, dressed to the high, right up to her neck, and they still would not allow her to speak because she's a woman, because they might be exposed to a woman's voice, which is something it's almost as twisted, I think, out of proportion that within the Jewish fabric as are the Sabbateans and the Frankists. I don't want to go into that subject, but we're talking about subversions of Judaism from the 17th and 18th century, which were also completely turning Judaism on its head. So, there has to be kind of an equilibrium. Now, I want to go to your comments, Avi, about the secularists. I mean, I think that they've become more reactionary, besides the fact that at the core, you have a communist core that is anti-religion and is anti-American and is, into some kind of their own religion, frankly. This utopian idea that everybody should become equal in a world that becomes a gigantic ant colony.
Utopia.
That's right. And that's as insidious and as wrong as anything. But the average liberal-leaning Jew in Israel is not that, but yet they've become more reactionary in the face of this movement of black hats, as we call them here, in that they've become anti-religious. I mean, I could give you one anecdote. I have a cousin from Israel, grew up Orthodox. His parents had made Aliyah, and they were religious, but he fell away from it. And he married a woman who was very ultra-secular. And they were visiting Boston, where we live. We invited them over for Shabbos. And she said, "Oh, no, we won't do Shabbos. That's what they do. I'm like, we're just inviting you to have Shabbos dinner. No, we can't do that." Now, that is like a super reactionary. I mean, it's like it is. And I think that is typical, more so, of people on the left side of the spectrum here. So just like you've got on the right side, the ultra-Orthodox people we've already discussed what they're about. On the left side, you have this other version of people who are just utterly rejecting Judaism altogether and anything related to it. And they're being not kosher in Israel. How could you be not kosher in Israel? I mean, it's crazy. I mean, when I was in Israel, we were looking forward to going to a McDonald's and having a kosher meal. And we got there and they said, "Oh, no, we're not kosher." How does that happen? I mean, it's become so secular that there's no regard at all for Jewish values.
By the way, the McDonald's in Israel is not kosher if it is open on the Sabbath.
Okay, so the food is kosher.
McDonald's is kosher.
Oh, that's good to know. Okay.
The meat supplier.
The meat is kosher.
Listen, you go to a lot. All the restaurants are open on Shabbat.
Yeah.
But they're not kosher.
Right.
But in the hotel, and you go to a hotel, you have to be fit. The hotel kitchens are working. That's kosher.
So when you say they're not kosher, it's not that they're having treif.
No treif.
It's that they're not observing Shabbos. Exactly. They don't have like a means.
In Tel Aviv and in the mixed cities with Arabs, with our Christian Arabs, don't forget Muslims don't eat pork.
Right.
But the Christian Arabs serve pork, and there are restaurants that serve pork, and there are Israeli restaurants in Tel Aviv that serve pork. Listen, I've got to tell you something.
Yeah.
I travel around the United States 4 or 5 months out of the year. And I eat in any Christian home. I eat in any restaurant. I go to Red Lobster. I don't eat lobster.
Right. I mean, look, frankly, I don't want to get into my own thing, but yeah, that's sort of where I am as well. I don't eat treif, but I will go to a restaurant if I will go to a family home if I'm invited.
You have to.
But I won't have meat. It's just, but there's a way to go about it. Whereas, of course, we can say that when you get to the ultra-Orthodox, they do not go into a restaurant. They won't touch a plate that was, I mean, look, again, it's a personal preference. They're trying to be religious, fine. They want, this makes them closer to God, maybe. I don't know if they see it that way. I hope they do. I'm for that, but it's the idea of imposing that on others that bothers me.
Yeah.
Those
I have,
standards.
I have a quick joke for you. A very ultra-Orthodox rabbi dies, goes to heaven, gets to heaven, and the guy in charge there, I don't want to say St. Peter because then it would be a Christian joke. But
Okay.
anyway,
The angel Gabriel.
the angel Gabriel, so this rabbi says, hey, listen, I'm hungry. Who's the mashgiach here? Who is the kosher inspector who approves of the kosher food in heaven? And so the angel Gabriel said, well, God himself. He said, God himself. Okay, give me an apple on a paper plate.
Okay. No, I mean, look, one of my secular relatives who happens to be a native Israeli, he said to me that it's gotten so extreme, frankly, that there are people who they have to have 5 hechshes on a bottle of water, with rabbinic seals. I mean, look, again, I don't want to, if that's what people want to do, if that makes them feel holier, good, that's fine. Rabbi, I don't know if you knew Rabbi Marvin Anselman.
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay, I interviewed him. He passed away recently. He was the author of To Eliminate the Opiate. Interesting man. He spent half the year in Israel, half the year in the United States. And he said, look, the Israelis, by just proxy, are fulfilling more precepts of the Torah than an Orthodox American just by being there.
Right.
They're fulfilling probably about a third of the 516 precepts that were put forth in the Talmud just by being there. They have to, in a way, observe Shabbos to an extent, because a lot of things are quieted down on Shabbos. They have to observe kosher to an extent because the meat is kosher. I think that there's a lot of validity to that. I only wish that on the liberal side, maybe there was a little bit more education, frankly, about being a Jew. I mean, I don't think that that's being done in the schools. There's an ignorance that level that actually is, in a way, more so than American Jews even. But getting back to Israel, let's get back to the topic at hand. And that is the conflict now. The issue of judicial reform, the protests, the counter-protests. Israel doesn't have a constitution. And so as such, there is no delineated separation of powers, and there's no codified role or lane for the various branches of the Israeli government to operate in, like we have in the United States. The Supreme Court and the federal bench, they can't go too far outside the purview, and they have to be careful, and likewise the president, and likewise the Congress. So I think that my analysis is that in Israel, the judiciary has exceeded its powers, and that one of the evidences that I see that backs that is that the judiciary itself appoints and promotes its own members, and that to me seems corrupt. At least in the United States, when you have a judicial nominee, they have to be heard. There's a Senate, there are hearings, both sides get to question, there's a vote. Israel, that's not the case. So what is the deal with the judiciary in Israel?
Well, at this time, and what has been going on for the last 100 years, is that left-wing socialist judges appoint left-wing socialist judges. And there's no room for any outsiders. There's no room for nationalists. There's no room for Arabs. There's no room for Sephardic Jews. My wife is Sephardic, and she's talking about all the judges that are Sephardic, but they never make it into the Supreme Court.
I see.
The Supreme Court is socialist, and they only accept Ashkenazi Jews of their ilk.
I
And
see.
that's what Netanyahu is trying to change. He's trying to balance it
This seems perfectly reasonable for him to want to do that. Why are they so agitated over it?
because they lose control.
So it's just a matter of power.
It's all about ego and power. Correct.
Well, I mean, one of the raison d'etre they claim is that they're afraid that the a reformed Supreme Court is going to be taken over by right-wing judges who are going to then implement religious laws. Is that true?
Well, what they are now is trying to do is something like you have in the United States of America, where if you have, like, I think President Trump brought in 3 conservative judges.
He did.
And then Biden is a liberal, so he brings in people he likes. And then let's say
That is how it works. Yes.
so every 4 to 8 years, like a term limit to the president, so you have a fifth in the Supreme Court, and a balance is maintained. And that's what Israel is trying to do. But the left-wing people, like you said, they're threatening a civil war.
And the thing is that, and I could have predicted this, that once the Netanyahu government backed down in the face of the army starting to side with the protesters, now that they're still out there protesting. They're still out there. I mean, I knew that. I figured that. Is George Soros involved?
You know what? Let me tell you a little story.
Okay.
I met once a colonel from the Israeli army, and he was being considered for a brigadier. And they made a barbecue in his house, and he invited all of the high command of the army, general staff. And he lives in Gibeon. Gibeon is in the West Bank.
Okay.
And when they came to his house, he said, "We didn't know that you were one of them." And he was terminated.
Oh my God.
And when they fired me from the Prime Minister's office, they said, "We know your political views, and we're going to put lies in your trial, and you will never, ever again get a job in Israel." Because I was good.
Sounds like that's what they did to you, Avi.
Yeah. And I'm very thankful to Christians. I make a living. I go and I lecture. I'm like an Israeli.
Understood.
And I'm embraced by the Christians. And I have to tell you, I didn't like Christians when I came to Israel. I thought I was escaping the Christians. But after being in 1,000 churches, I've come to fall in love with Christian people and Messianics and all these other groups, and I realized.
Well, I want to ask you about that in a minute, but let's stay with this subject.
So what I'm saying is that I have been personally a victim of this socialist totalitarian control of the civil service in Israel.
And that includes the army.
That includes the army. You cannot become anything higher than a colonel if you are right wing. That has to be fixed also. But I'll tell you.
So then the reform has to be, in a way, really across the board, to just not to get rid, to just bring some balance, some checks and balances, which is really the secret sauce of the United States. And even though we've had it compromised in recent decades with the rise of the deep state and their unelected authorities, which doesn't matter whether you have liberals or conservatives, Democrats or Republicans, they run the show increasingly. Nevertheless, the principle still applies here, and it permeates American life from top to bottom. This idea of checking and balancing opposite views in order to diffuse power and in order to make sure that one side doesn't become too corrupt. In Israel, it looks like the kind of corruption from the secular left has been there since day one. I think that maybe it's a little bit less, it's been diffused a little bit with Netanyahu, with Begin, with other governments, and Sharon, but it's still there and it still pervades. And it's going to be a very difficult thing to tackle as a means to bring about balance.
Correct.
What's the deal, Avi, with Messianic Christians?
Okay, now, firstly, I have to tell you, Messianics are maybe, some people say 10,000 in Israel, some people say 15, some people say 20,000, but out of a population of 7.5 million Christians and Jews, 10, 15,000, it's a very small group. and the Messianics themselves are very divided against each other for ideological reasons, like churches. You know, in America, all these churches are all divided against each
Sure.
other. I have another joke for you. What's the difference between Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists? Northern Baptists go to hell.
Oh, I mean, that's like the old joke about where you have two Jews, you got three synagogues. One for you, one for me, and one where no one goes.
Exactly.
So yeah, but I guess, Avi, look, I'm going to be blunt here. I am not comfortable with proselytizing in Israel by Christians.
Right.
You know, there's a very, very good Israeli news program that is run by Christians that I watch in the United States. The name of which escapes me right now. You probably know what I'm talking about. They do a very responsible pro-Israel broadcast. They interview high-level Israeli officials on all sides, but they are Christian, and I think that they are walking very, very carefully. They're treading lightly because they want to retain. It's kind of like a tacit agreement between them and the Israeli government. We'll give you access. We'll give you interviews. We'll be there to help you go to get inside scoops, but no proselytizing. And they don't. And yet sometimes they might move a little on the envelope, but for the most part, they adhere to this agreement. I don't think that Israel needs Christian proselytizing right now. They've got enough problems. I mean, there's too much conflict between the various Jewish groups. I mean, the last thing they need is that. I mean, I'm sorry, maybe, am I being authoritarian here? But I tend to agree with the government's, I don't want to use the word crackdown, but I would say that there's more than a antipathy toward that kind of activity in Israel.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
What you're saying is indeed the mainline Israeli approach. But I'm going to throw a really hard fastball at you, a hard curveball at you. And it's been a few years since we've chatted. But I had lunch with a neo-Nazi in Florida. I didn't know he was a neo-Nazi. And I said, Avi, you're a very special Jew. I like you very much because you are not like those Democrats. The Democrats are Bolshevik traitor. And I said, no. I said, but 1/3 of the Jews voted for Trump. So, you can't say all of it. But the numbers are going in the direction of the Republicans. But the point was, he finally said to me, remember the killing of George Floyd?
Mm-hmm.
So he said, what do you think about that? I said, if George Floyd knew he was a criminal, they shouldn't mess around with him. Just take him to court and put him in jail. But to kill him was murder. So
although I just to not get into a subject, but I don't think he was trying to kill George Floyd.
No. He was trying to change a $20 bill, I think.
Yeah, but George Floyd had serious health problems and he had a heart attack. I don't think that Officer Chauvin meant to kill him.
Well,
and I don't think it had anything to do with race either. If anybody was behaving that way, they would have been retained.
He said, what do you think about defund the police?
Yeah, it was used as a means to push an agenda, frankly.
So I
also I might add, I'm not suggesting that there isn't police brutality against black people either. That's something that is real, but I think it was enhanced, it was weaponized as a way to launch those protests, which I think damaged President Trump, and which they went ahead and they looted black businesses and burned black neighborhoods in almost an American version of Kristallnacht. But let's not get into that.
No, I want to get into you're talking about witnessing Christianity to the Jews.
Okay, back to the subject.
So then you say, what is it about defund the police? I said, well, I think it's horrible because we have killing and crime and chaos. And he was going like this with his head. I said, why are you saying no? He said, defund the police is fantastic. Because before the killing of George Floyd, we had 3 million militia members, and now we have 30 million militia members with guns. I don't know, but that's what it said to me.
No, that's an exaggeration.
The first thing we're going to do is kill the Jews in America.
Yeah. Okay,
And
well,
I listen from my work in the states. I know that the vast majority of militia people are good people, and they're not going to kill the Jews. But I would say there's a percentage there, maybe up to 10%, that are
yeah, I
neo-Muslim.
agree with that. Yeah,
And I
they're
was
out
looking
there.
at that, and I worked with Canadian police, and they said to me that the Muslims there, 90% are peacekeeping, 10% are terrorists paid by the Middle East. They're going to kill the Jews. The neo-Nazis are going to kill the Jews. Black Lives Matter hate the Jews because who's responsible for the abortion of black babies? The Jewish liberals who support abortion. So the Jews have to be killed by the blacks.
Yeah, that's by the way, that's untrue. But I get the fact that that's a piece of propaganda for them.
And Antifa, they're also against Jew or Christian. And so the point I'm saying is, I believe we are going to be seeing a massive aliyah to Israel of millions of Jews, and because the intermarriage rate with Christians is 80%, there will be a lot of Christians moving to Israel with the Jewish spouses and families. So there will be, I believe, because Christians and Jews are like family, there'll be debate about religion. So, it's going to be very hard.
Yeah, and how is that going to affect the nature of the Jewish state? I mean, Israel, the mission, the raison d'etre of Israel is a Jewish state. I understand that there are non-Jews. I understand there are Christians and Muslims. They have a right to citizenship, and they have all the rights. They should enjoy all the blessings of being there. But I would urge them to recognize the Jewish nature of the country they're living in. And I would even go a slight step further and suggest that they consider conversion to Judaism. And I say this for Muslims, by the way.
The rabbis.
So the rabbis are well, that's just it. A lot of Palestinians who are in Israel, those who maybe didn't come in during the great migration of the late 19th century in order to take advantage of the economic opportunities that the Jewish migration was creating. A lot of them that have families going back many, many centuries, some of the tribal heads, they have Jewish background.
Right.
If you look at the DNA, look at the Samaritans in Nablus. I mean, they have Jewish background. I mean, they probably over the centuries at some point converted to Islam because the Islamic authorities were in control.
Yeah.
And maybe, am I being way out on a limb by suggesting that they might consider reconnecting with that background? And if they want to,
I agree with you 100%.
But if they want to participate in Israeli life, and they want to, Israeli/Palestinian life, then they should consider becoming Jews. And if these rabbis are being obstructionist over that, I say that's an obstacle that Israel needs to overcome.
Do you ever see the movie Patton?
Yes.
So you remember the Battle of the Bulge?
Yeah, vaguely, but yes.
So Patton falls in the priest, the man of religion of the combat unit. He says, I want to write a prayer. We've got too many damn crowds. We're going to have an opening so the Air Force can come in and do their stuff and destroy the Germans, So the man of God, the Christian priest or pastor says, I can't write a prayer asking for God's help, but I say to kill you human beings. So Patton looked at him, this has been taken out of the movie. So Patton said, either you do it, I'm going to fire you, and then get another man of God, and he's going to write the prayer. So the guy wrote the prayer, and he found out the U.S. Air Force didn't
Yeah. That's yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's analogous to what was. Yeah, that's horrible. And I've heard this that they refuse to convert Christians and Muslims to Judaism. That's wrong. It's
Orthodox Jews converted Orthodox in France and in Europe. As they come to America, the rabbis don't recognize the conversion.
It's so wrong. There is and by the way, it's against Judaism. It's against the Talmud. There is a process of conversion in Judaism. It's not up to them to decide they're going to ignore it. If they do, then they're apostates. They should be booted out of Judaism. I mean, they're the ones who should be booted out of the rabbinate if they're going to be obstructionists like that. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that the standards be lowered. To become a Jew is not an easy thing. It
Right.
requires, I think, at least a year of intense study. It requires, if you're going to have Palestinians become Jews, then they have to go through a process. But that process should be there. That's all.
You remember Maimonides? Maimonides was very pro-Muslim. He lived in
Yeah.
Muslim countries.
He was.
But Maimonides said that it is permissible for a Jew to teach a Christian the Torah because the Christian reveres the Torah. It is forbidden to teach a Muslim the Torah because the Muslim will use what he learns to destroy the Torah.
Well,
Maimonides said that.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose a Muslim qua Muslim, but if they want to become a Jew, that's another matter. Anyway, Avi, listen, I want to kind of wrap it up a little bit here for today, and I really am enjoying talking with you and making the connection again, and I'd like to do ongoing programming with you and maybe bring in other people to talk about Israel and to talk about Judaism, especially since, if I may, get in a quick shameless plug here, I just wrote a book myself called The Case for Jexit, The American Jewish Exodus from the Left. And it's a book that's, I write an average of 2 books a year. This one seems to have some legs. I mean, people are buying this one and they're interested in it. And I'm proud of it. And it's available at Amazon and at Barnes & Noble and elsewhere. But I want to do interviews with people in Israel to find out what the heck is going on. I think that there needs to be a way in which a polarization and this division can be bridged, maybe by bringing people of absolute opposite opinion together to discuss. You don't have to agree. You don't have to, but there has to be a means by which at least some common ground can be found, because if they become so separate and Israel reaches a point where they are not speaking to each other, then they're going to kill the golden goose, and everybody will lose. It'll be like at the time of the Second Temple, when the temple was destroyed by factions that eventually went to civil war. The Romans just sat there and waited for the thing to fall in their lap, because you had people who had reached a point where they could no longer get along and that they were irreconcilable. It's like a bitter divorce. That has to be avoided, because if you have that, you're going to have everyone out and gone.
Right.
Israel is surrounded by enemies that are watching it, just like the Romans, waiting for their opportunity to walk in and pick up the pieces. And, it's kind of like, everyone's going to lose. So there is right off the bat that as a common ground, even if you don't recognize Israel's right to exist, which is there on the far left and right fringes, you have a family there. You have children, grandchildren. You've got a stake in the society. And I think that needs to be appealed to in this case.
I agree.
So, Avi, would you like my listeners and viewers to have information about you and a website or where they can reach you?
The website is self-explanatory. I have tons of teachings on YouTube, Avi Lipkin. They're all free, and people can get all my teachings there. And if people write to me, I will definitely answer that.
Excellent. Avi Lipkin, I want to thank you for joining me today. God bless you. Thank you, sir. We should do it again soon. God bless Israel. God bless America. Thank you very much, Avi.